The deed hit the table with a sound like a gunshot. Louisa Bailey stared at it. Her hands, raw from 3 years of scrubbing other people's laundry, hovered just above the worn pine surface of the Dusty Creek Saloon's back room, trembling with something she could not name. Outside, the wind drove red dust against the window in waves, and the muffled clamor of the afternoon crowd pressed through the thin walls like a held breath about to break. She could feel the eyes of Ezekiel Merritt on her face, those pale gray eyes she had spent 3 years trying to forget, 3 years convincing herself she hated, and she could not look up. "I bought you a home," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the way it always had been, the voice of a man who had learned long ago that silence was the sharpest weapon in any room. "It is yours. No conditions, no strings. I'm not asking for anything back." The paper bore the territorial seal of the state of Texas, signed by the county recorder's office in Abilene, dated 6 weeks prior. The name on the deed was not Ezekiel Merritt. It was Louisa Bailey. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the document as though she expected it to dissolve, to reveal itself as one more cruel trick in a life that had handed her almost nothing but cruelty. 3 years. He had walked out of Dusty Creek without a word, without a letter, without a single ghost of explanation, and the town had absorbed his absence the way dry earth absorbs rain completely, greedily, leaving no trace. She had told herself she did not care. She had told herself his silence was the clearest truth he had ever spoken, that whatever tenderness she had imagined between them had been nothing more than the desperate invention of a lonely woman who should have known better. And now here he stood, broader across the shoulders than she remembered, a beard she didn't recognize shadowing a jaw she knew by heart, trailed dust on his coat and something ancient and aching in the set of his eyes, and he had laid a deed to a house on the table in front of her like a man laying down the last card in a game where everything he owned was wagered. "Ezekiel," she said, and her voice cracked on the second syllable in a way that humiliated her. "What in the name of God did you do?" He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down slowly, like a man whose body had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and had only just been given permission to rest. "I did what I should have done before I left," he said. "I fixed it." That single word, "fixed," opened something in Louisa's chest that she had nailed shut with every ounce of pride she possessed, and everything that spilled out of it was terrifying and furious and completely beyond her control. To understand why the deed meant what it meant, and why Louisa Bailey's hands shook when she touched it, and why Ezekiel Merritt had ridden 400 miles through some of the most unforgiving country in West Texas to lay it in front of her, you had to go back to the summer of 1878, to the week before the worst heat of July had settled over Dusty Creek like a boot heel grinding down on a man already pinned to the dirt. Louisa had arrived in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1876. She was 22 years old, the only surviving child of a Missouri schoolteacher who had died of typhoid fever the previous winter, leaving her a small trunk of books, a silver locket, and $43 in paper money, enough to buy passage west and almost nothing else. She had heard that the frontier towns along the cattle trail routes were hungry for women who could work, who could teach, who could sew or cook or keep accounts, and Louisa could do all of those things. What nobody had told her was that Dusty Creek was also the kind of town that made quick decisions about a woman who arrived alone with no family, and no husband and no man to speak on her behalf. The town was a raw, ambitious place, planted in the flat scrub country between two dry creek beds that ran full and violent in spring and were baked to cracked clay by August. It had a main street of weathered storefronts, a church with no steeple yet, a livery, a general store run by a man named Harlan Price who overcharged for everything and underdelivered on most of it, a saloon called the Copper Bit, and a newly established schoolhouse that had been the reason Louisa had written to the town council in the first place. The council had written back saying they needed a schoolteacher and offering room and board in exchange for 6 months of service, after which they would discuss wages. What they had neglected to mention in that letter was that the room they were offering was a storage closet behind the church, that the board consisted of whatever the congregation's charity committee deemed appropriate that week, and that the previous schoolteacher had left not because she had found better work elsewhere but because the town's leading citizen, a cattle broker named Edmund Farr, had made her life impossible until she did. Edmund Farr owned the largest parcel of land within 20 miles of Dusty Creek. He was 51 years old, thick in the neck, with the kind of confidence that came not from intelligence or courage, but from the simple fact of never having been told no by anyone in his immediate geography. He had decided within 3 weeks of Louisa's arrival that she would make a suitable second wife, his first having succumbed to a fever 4 years prior. He had decided this without consulting Louisa, which was entirely consistent with the way Edmund Farr made all of his decisions. Louisa had told him, politely and then firmly, and then with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, that she was not interested. Edmund Farr heard her words and processed them the way a man processes whether, as an inconvenience he expected, would pass. It did not pass. What happened instead was that the storage closet arrangement quietly ended after 3 months, replaced with nothing. What happened was that the charity committee found other causes to direct their generosity toward. What happened was that 2 of the town council members whose names appeared on the letter that had brought Louisa to Dusty Creek in the first place were also men who had borrowed money from Edmund Farr, and men who owe money tend to see the world through the eyes of the man who holds their debt. By the autumn of 1876, Louisa was still teaching, because she loved the work and because the 15 children who showed up each morning needed her more than she needed her pride. But she was washing laundry for wages to cover her rent at the boarding house run by a widow named Martha Gale, who was one of the few people in town who treated Louisa as an equal human being and not as a problem to be solved or a resource to be claimed. It was in Martha Gale's boarding house, on a cold November evening, that Louisa first spoke to Ezekiel Merritt. He had ridden in 2 days before from somewhere nobody could quite agree on. Some said El Paso, some said New Mexico territory. Some said he had the look of a man coming from somewhere even further than that, somewhere that didn't have a name on any map currently in circulation. He was 27 years old, lean and angular, with dark hair that needed cutting and those pale gray eyes that seemed in certain lights to hold the color of a winter sky just before snow. He spoke rarely and listened constantly, which made most people uncomfortable in his presence. He had paid Martha Gale a week's rent in silver coin and had taken the room at the top of the stairs without a word of complaint about its size or its single drafty window. He came down to supper that first evening and sat at the end of the long table, and Louisa was already there, eating quickly because she had papers to grade before morning, and he had looked at the stack of schoolwork beside her plate and said, quietly and without preamble, "You are the teacher." "I am," she said, not looking up. "Do you need help grading arithmetic?" he asked. "I am good with numbers." She had looked up then, startled into something like laughter because it was such an unexpected and practical offer from a complete stranger. "I do not know you," she said. "Ezekiel Merritt," he said. "I do not know you either. That is why I introduced myself first." She had stared at him for a moment and then, for the first time in several months, she had smiled. "Louisa Bailey," she said. "And yes, I would be grateful for the help." That was how it began. Not with lightning or poetry, but with arithmetic homework at a boarding house supper table, which, given the 2 people involved, was perhaps exactly right. Over the following weeks, Ezekiel Merritt proved to be a man of genuine, unsettling depth. He had been educated somewhere, more than a frontier education, more than a cowhand's passing literacy, and he had a mind that moved fast and quiet behind those steady eyes. He did not talk about himself except in the smallest necessary pieces, offering facts the way a careful man offers water in a drought. Just enough, never more. He had worked cattle in New Mexico territory. He had worked freight routes along the Pecos River. He knew horses the way some men knew scripture, by instinct and by faith, and by a long, intimate history of getting things wrong and learning from it. He was also, Louisa discovered, watching Edmund Farr with an attention that was too deliberate to be casual. "He comes to the school," she told Ezekiel one evening when they had fallen into the habit of sitting on the boarding house porch after supper and talking through whatever needed talking through. "He stands at the fence and watches through the window. He has done it 4 times this month." Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. "Has he touched you?" "No," she said. "He would not dare yet. He wants me to think of him as a suitor, not a threat. He believes that if he simply persists long enough, I will come to see things his way." She paused. "He has that type of patience." "Some men mistake persistence for persuasion," Ezekiel said. "They are not the same." "No," she agreed. "They are not." She looked at him in the dark, the lamplight from the window casting a warm stripe across the side of his face, and she noticed, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time she allowed herself to notice, that he was a man she found herself wanting to trust. The sensation was alarming, given her recent history with trust, and she filed it away carefully under things to examine later, when she was alone and could afford to be honest with herself. He stayed through November and through December, and into the early months of 1877, and during that time something grew between them that had no agreed-upon name, but that both of them felt with the kind of certainty that makes denial feel like lying. He helped her haul water for the school when the town pump froze. She taught him, to his evident surprise and delight, that he had been solving a particular type of surveying equation incorrectly for years, and she demonstrated the correct method on the back of an envelope, with the calm authority of a woman who had been teaching mathematics since she was 15. He had looked at her solution and then at her, and something in his expression had shifted in a way that went well past admiration. The winter settled over Dusty Creek with its usual brutality, and Louisa Bailey and Ezekiel Merritt moved carefully around the edges of what they felt, the way people move around a fire when they are cold enough to want it desperately, but wise enough to know that fire can also burn. Then Edmund Farr made his move. It was February of 1877, a gray afternoon with the threat of sleet in the air, and Edmund Farr arrived at the school at closing time with 2 of his hired men, and a formal written proposal of marriage addressed to Louisa Bailey, notarized by the county clerk's office in Abilene, accompanied by a letter from 2 members of the town council stating that they strongly recommended she give the matter her most serious consideration. Louisa read both documents in the doorway of the school, while the last of her students disappeared down the road, and then she handed them back to Edmund Farr with steady hands and a steadier voice, and told him that her answer was no, that it would remain no, and that she would appreciate it if he stopped sending messages through official channels, as if her answer were a matter of public record rather than a private decision. Edmund Farr smiled at her the way men smile when they believe they are being patient. "Miss Bailey," he said, "you are a practical woman. I can see that. I respect it. But I want you to understand that Dusty Creek is my town in every way that matters, and a practical woman would think carefully about how she intends to survive in a town that belongs to another person." She felt the threat in it, clean and cold, like a blade kept in a cold room. She did not flinch. "Good evening, Mr. Farr," she said, and she shut the school door. But the threat was real, and they both knew it. Within 2 weeks, the town council voted not to renew her teaching contract on the grounds that the school budget was insufficient. This was a transparent lie. She had seen the school's accounts and the budget was adequate. But the vote was 3-2, and there was nothing she could do. The school board replaced her with a man from Abilene who had a fraction of her ability and a full complement of powerful allies. Martha Gale kept Louisa's room at the boarding house, reducing the rent without comment, and Louisa expanded her laundry work to include the Copper Bit Saloon and 3 of the larger households on the western edge of town. She was not beaten. She was not going anywhere, but the shape of her life in Dusty Creek had narrowed considerably, and the ground beneath it felt less stable than it had. Ezekiel saw all of this. He saw it the way he saw most things, quietly, thoroughly, without announcing what he observed. And in March of 1877, he did something Louisa did not know about until years later. He rode to Abilene and spent 3 days going through land records. What he found there was something that Farr had buried carefully, but not carefully enough. A tax lien on a small parcel of land at the eastern edge of town that had gone unpaid for 6 years, because the original owner, an elderly widow named Clara Hess, had died without heirs, and the land had fallen into legal limbo, claimed by Farr through a county administrator who happened to be one of his business associates, but never fully cleared through the proper territorial channels. The parcel was modest, a house, a kitchen garden plot, a small barn, but it sat on a corner lot with creek access, and it was solidly built. And more importantly, it was legally vulnerable in a way that a man who knew how to work the county recorder's office might be able to exploit. Ezekiel also found something else in Abilene. He found a man named Cole Prout, who had worked cattle for Farr 3 years prior, and had been let go under circumstances he described. When asked, with a particular bitterness that suggested there was a great deal more to the story, Prout told Ezekiel about a deal Farr had made with a land speculator out of Fort Worth that was not entirely legal in its methods, involving the forged signature of a Comanche land agent on a grazing rights agreement. It was the kind of information that, if it reached the right people in the right places, would cost Edmund Farr considerably more than money. Ezekiel rode back to Dusty Creek and said nothing about any of this to Louisa. He had a plan, but the plan required time and money, and he had neither at that precise moment. What he did have was a certainty that he had not experienced in years. The certainty that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, sitting across from a woman who graded papers at a boarding house supper table and argued about mathematics with the joyful precision of someone who truly loved ideas, and that whatever it cost him to protect what she was building here, it would be worth it. He told her the beginning of it one evening in April, sitting on the porch with the last of the spring coolness in the air before summer would make the outdoors intolerable. He told her he had gone to Abilene on personal business, that he had found some information about the Hess land parcel, that he believed there might be a way to clear it through the recorder's office and secure it for an independent party someone Farr could not control. Louisa looked at him for a long time. "You are describing a considerable amount of legal work," she said. "And money." "Yes," he said. "Why would you do that?" she asked. Not ungratefully, but with the careful directness of a woman who had learned that generosity without motive was rarer than gold in this part of the world. He looked at her. In the warm light of the porch lamp, his gray eyes were almost blue. "Because it is the right thing to do," he said, "and because you deserve to stand on ground that nobody can pull out from under you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said very softly, "Ezekiel." "Yes," he said. "Are you saying this to me because you want something in return?" He shook his head slowly. "I am saying it because it is true," he said. "What happens after that is whatever you decide it is." There it was. The closest either of them had come to saying what was actually between them, laid out in those plain words like a surveyor's line across open ground. "Here is where I stand. Here is what I see. You can decide what to do with the information." Louisa looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about what it had cost her to trust anyone since her mother had died, and about how Ezekiel Merritt had never once in 5 months given her a single reason to distrust him, and about how that, too, was a kind of information. "All right," she said. "All right," he repeated. "All right," she said again. "Tell me the rest of the plan." He did. They stayed on that porch until the lamp oil ran low and the temperature dropped, and Martha Gale knocked on the window to remind them that decent people went to bed before midnight. And by the time they went inside they had a plan, a rough one with considerable gaps where money was supposed to be, but a plan nonetheless. What happened next was the part of the story that Louisa had never fully understood until much later, and that Ezekiel had never fully explained because there were parts of it he was ashamed of, and parts of it that were complicated by things he had not been ready to share. He left in June of 1877. He left quietly, as he had arrived, no announcement, no dramatic farewell, just an absence where there had been a presence. His room at the boarding house cleared of his few possessions, his horse gone from the livery. He left a note for Martha Gale that said only, "Please tell Miss Bailey I had urgent business and that I intend to return as soon as I am able." He left nothing for Louisa directly, not a letter, not a word. Just that second-hand message and his absence like a door, closed very quietly in the night. Louisa received the message from Martha Gale at breakfast and kept her face so still that Martha, who was a perceptive woman, reached across the table and put her hand on Louisa's arm without saying anything at all. It was the kindness of that touch that cracked Louisa open for about 30 seconds, and then she put herself back together with the thoroughness and speed of a woman who had been putting herself back together all her life, and she finished her breakfast and went to do the day's work. She waited 3 weeks for a letter, nothing. She waited a month, nothing. She told herself that men like Ezekiel Merritt moved through the world according to their own logic, and that she had made the mistake of reading his attentiveness as something more than it was, that she had projected onto his quiet steadiness a commitment he had never actually articulated, that she was a fool and a romantic fool at that, which was the worst kind. She told herself all of this very firmly and very frequently, and as the summer of 1877 ground on and the heat hammered the town and Edmund Farr resumed his patient, relentless campaign of making her existence in Dusty Creek as difficult as possible, she believed it less and less. By autumn she had stopped waiting. She had done what she always did when the emotional ground shifted beneath her. She put her head down and she worked. She took on more laundry. She began giving private arithmetic lessons to 2 merchants' children on Saturday mornings in exchange for store credit at the general store. She kept her room at Martha Gale's, and she managed her $43 very carefully, and she did not think about Ezekiel Merritt. Except that she thought about him constantly, in the way you think about a wound that is healing, not because you want to think about it but because it keeps making itself known. Edmund Farr's pressure intensified that autumn. He bought out the merchant who had rented Louisa a small commercial space for her laundry operation, and the new terms made it impossible for her to stay. He had 2 of her laundry clients quietly discouraged from using her services. He filed a complaint with the county office about the private arithmetic lessons, claiming she was operating an unlicensed school, which was technically arguable under territorial law even if it was morally contemptible. The complaint was dismissed after a letter from the county recorder's office noting that informal private tutoring did not fall under the statute in question. But the legal process had cost Louisa time and anxiety she could not afford. She was not broken. She was not going to be broken by Edmund Farr or anyone else. But she was tired in a way that went beyond physical, and she was alone in a way that she had been managing carefully for 2 years now. And some nights she sat on the boarding house porch by herself in the dark and wondered what Ezekiel Merritt was doing and whether he had thought about her even once since he left. And she hated herself a little for wondering. She had her answer in the spring of 1879, not through a letter, not through a message, but through the front door of the Copper Bit Saloon's back room on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when he walked in and put a deed on the table in front of her. She was there because the Copper Bit was one of her laundry clients, and the saloon owner's wife, a practical woman named Bess Holloway, let Louisa use the back room to sort and fold during the afternoon hours when it was quiet. It was not glamorous work. It was also not the life that a man who loved her had promised to fix, and then abandoned without explanation, and then apparently fixed anyway while she had spent the intervening 2 years not knowing whether to be grateful or furious. "It is yours," he said again, watching her face, No conditions. Louisa pressed her palms flat on the table. She took a breath. She was 25 years old and she had been managing her own life in this town for 3 years, and she had not cried in front of another person since her mother's funeral. And she was not going to cry now in the back room of the Copper Bit Saloon in front of a man who had left without a word and come back with a deed. "You left," she said. "I know," he said. "You said nothing. You wrote nothing. You left a message with Martha Gale that amounted to almost nothing, and She stopped. She made herself breathe. "I do not understand, Ezekiel. I need you to explain it to me, all of it from the beginning, because I am looking at this deed, and I do not know whether to thank you or tell you to take it back." He leaned forward. He folded his hands on the table, those long, careful hands that she had watched grade arithmetic papers and mend fence wire, and hold a coffee cup with the same deliberate economy of motion. And he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something raw and unguarded. The expression of a man who has rehearsed a conversation many times and knows that none of his rehearsals will survive contact with the actual moment. "I left because Cole Prout came to find me," he said. In June of 1877, Prout had gone to the territorial marshal's office in Abilene with what he knew about Farr's dealings with the land speculator and the forged grazing rights agreement. The marshal's office was interested, but they needed a witness, someone who had also encountered Farr's methods firsthand and who could corroborate Prout's account. They needed me because I had been through the land records and found the pattern of the Hess parcel manipulation, and because I had worked cattle routes that crossed Farr's land and knew the geography in a way that was useful to the investigation. Louisa stared at him. "The territorial marshal," she said slowly. "It was not a quick process," he said. "These things never are. It required me to be available to testify, to follow the investigation wherever it needed to go, and the investigation went first to Fort Worth and then to Dallas and eventually to the territorial court in Austin. I was not free to correspond during much of that time, not because I didn't want to, but because the investigation required that my involvement be undisclosed, and a letter to Dusty Creek, Texas, addressed to Louisa Bailey, from a man who had recently been going through Edmund Farr's land records in Abilene, was not a letter that could be sent without putting both of us at risk." The weight of what he was saying settled over her slowly, the way the desert cools slowly after dark in layers, each one taking time. "Farr," she said. "He had people watching." "He had people watching everything," Ezekiel said. "He had a deputy in the county clerk's office who flagged any unusual inquiries into his properties. He had a man in the Abilene Postal Service who was not above examining correspondence." When Prout first went to the marshal's office, there was genuine concern that Farr would learn of the investigation before it had progressed far enough to be safe. "The marshal was very clear with me that any outside contact could compromise not only the case but Prout's safety and mine." "And mine," Louisa said, because she understood immediately what he was not saying, that if Farr had known that Ezekiel Merritt was in Austin testifying against him, and that Louisa Bailey was the woman he was in Dusty Creek because of, she would have been in danger. Real danger. The kind that men like Edmund Farr arrange without getting their own hands visibly dirty. "Yes," Ezekiel said, "and yours." The silence in the back room of the Copper Bit was profound. Outside, someone was playing a harmonica on the front porch, something mournful and tuneless. The afternoon light slanted through the single high window in long amber bars. "What happened to Farr?" she asked. Ezekiel looked at his hands. "He was charged in the federal territorial court last summer. Fraud, land manipulation, and a third charge relating to a cattle arrangement that was discovered in the course of the investigation that even Prout hadn't known about. He agreed to a settlement rather than risk a public trial, gave up his territorial land claims and a substantial sum of money in fines. He moved his remaining operations to Fort Worth. He will not be back." Louisa sat with that. Edmund Farr was gone. Not run off by gossip or social pressure, not temporarily inconvenienced, but legally dismantled and removed from her geography by a process that had taken 2 years and one man who had left without explanation, because the explanation itself was the danger. The house, she said. The Hess parcel. The legal limbo was resolved as part of the settlement process, he said. The county recorder's office cleared the title. I filed the acquisition papers 6 weeks ago with money I have been putting aside since I left. The deed is legal and clean and entirely in your name. She looked down at the deed again, at her name, written in the recorder's official hand. Louisa Bailey, not Mrs. Somebody. Not the property of some institution or some man's generosity on conditions. Louisa Bailey, sole owner. You spent 2 years of your wages on this, she said, and some of the settlement, he said. There was a portion allocated to citizens whose livelihoods were damaged by FAR's practices. I made the case that you qualified. She looked up. You argued for reparations for me. You lost your teaching position because of his interference, Ezekiel said simply. It was not a difficult case to make. And there it was, the full shape of what he had done, and why, and how, and the cost of it on both sides. 2 years of silence that was not coldness but protection. 2 years of distance that was not abandonment but necessity. 2 years of a woman gritting her teeth and keeping herself together in a difficult town, not knowing that the man who had left was spending those years systematically dismantling the source of her difficulties. She did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry, and she kept that promise, but her voice when she spoke was not entirely steady. You should have found a way to tell me, she said. I know it was not safe. I understand the reasoning, but I went 2 years not knowing, and that, she stopped. That hurt me, Ezekiel. It hurt me more than you may realize. I know, he said. The 2 words were simple and direct and entirely inadequate, and he seemed to know that too, because he did not try to follow them with anything elaborate. He held her gaze steadily, taking the weight of it. I was angry, she said. For a long time I was very angry. You had the right to be. I thought you had decided I wasn't worth coming back to. Something moved across his face that she didn't have a word for, something between pain and a depth of feeling so complete it was almost frightening. Louisa, he said, there was not a single day in 2 years that I did not think about coming back to you. Not one, she breathed. The harmonica outside had stopped. The amber light shifted. Somewhere in the main room of the saloon, glasses clinked and boots scraped on floorboards, and the ordinary afternoon went about its business, entirely indifferent to the 2 people in the back room who were trying to find their way back to a place they had been building before everything fell apart. I need time, she said finally. I need to think about this. About all of it. He nodded. He pushed his chair back and stood, and she noticed again how tired he looked, not weak, not defeated, but the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has finally set it down. Take whatever time you need, he said. I am staying at the boarding house. Martha Gale had a room. Martha Gale always has a room, Louisa said, and something in her voice softened despite herself, because Martha Gale's consistent generosity was one of the very few things in her life that had never once disappointed her. Ezekiel picked up his hat from where he had set it on the table, and he walked to the door, and he paused with his hand on the frame. The deed is real, he said. Whatever you decide about the rest of it, the house is yours. That part has no conditions. Then he walked out, and Louisa sat alone in the back room with the deed on the table in front of her and her hands in her lap, and the full complicated truth of the last 3 years, arranged around her like a landscape after a storm, raw and altered, and somehow, astonishingly, capable of growing things. She took the deed home to Martha Gale's that evening and spread it on her bed and read every word of it 3 times. The house on the Hess parcel was at the eastern edge of town, a square clapboard building with a kitchen, 2 rooms, a covered porch, and a kitchen garden plot that had gone wild with 3 years of neglect. She had walked past it occasionally, knowing its history, never imagining it as anything that might relate to her. She went to look at it the next morning, before the town was properly awake. She stood at the fence in the early light with her coat pulled close against the March chill, and she looked at the faded paint, and the sagging gate, and the kitchen garden that had become a tangle of wild growth, and she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in a long time: the specific, cautious desire to claim a piece of the world as her own. She went back to Martha Gale's and she thought for the rest of the day and into the evening, and then she went downstairs to where Ezekiel was sitting in the front parlor with a cup of coffee and a week-old newspaper, and she stood in the doorway until he looked up and she said, "I am going to accept the house." He nodded. "I need you to understand that accepting the house and deciding what I feel about you are two separate things," she said. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. She sat down in the chair across from him, and she picked up her own coffee cup from the side table where Martha kept cups for evening guests, and she held it with both hands. "Tell me everything that happened, not the summary you gave me yesterday. Everything, from the beginning, all of it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he set down his newspaper and he told her. He told her about Cole Prout coming to the boarding house that June morning in 1877 with a message from the marshal's office. He told her about the decision he had made in less time than it probably should have taken, the instinctive knowledge that he had to go, that the investigation was real and serious, and required someone who knew the land records, and that he could not tell her why because the risk was too real, and the decision had felt like cutting something vital but necessary. He told her about Fort Worth, about the 3 months of interviews with federal investigators and territorial attorneys, about the careful process of assembling the case against Farr in a way that would hold up in court, about the long periods of waiting and the short periods of intense testimony, about Cole Prout, who was a difficult man to like, but who had done a genuinely brave thing in going to the authorities, and who had ultimately been moved to a property in New Mexico territory as a condition of his cooperation. He told her about Austin, about the territorial court, about the settlement negotiations that had dragged on for 4 months while the attorneys for all parties argued over the precise terms of Farr's liability and the compensation structure for affected parties. He told her about the moment he had finally been released from his obligations to the investigation in January of 1879, and how the first thing he had done was ride to the county recorder's office in Abilene and begin the paperwork for the Hess parcel. He told her about riding back to Dusty Creek, about what it had felt like to ride back knowing that she had every right to refuse to see him, about how he had thought about it for the last 100 miles of that ride and had arrived at the conclusion that whatever she decided, she at least deserved to know the full truth and to have a piece of solid ground under her feet that nobody could move, regardless of what she decided about him. Louisa listened to all of it without interrupting. When he was done, she sat quietly for a while. Martha Gale had gone to bed. The fire in the parlor had burned low. Outside, the wind moved through Dusty Creek with the particular soft persistence of a March evening in West Texas, not angry but unrelenting, the way some of the best things in the world are. "There are things I want to say to you," Louisa said at last. "Some of them are angry things, some of them are not. I'm going to say them in no particular order because that is how they are arranged in my head." "All right," he said. "You should have found a way to tell me even a little," she said. "I understand the danger. I understand the investigation required discretion. But I had to leave urgently for reasons I cannot explain, and I will return would have been something. What you left me was almost nothing, and I built a very thorough and very wrong story in my head in the space that almost nothing creates, and living inside that story for 2 years was not something I would wish on anyone." "You are right," he said. "I was afraid that anything I sent would reach the wrong eyes, and in my fear I overcorrected into silence when I should have found a safer way. I was wrong." She nodded. "Yes," she said. "You were." She looked at her coffee cup. "The second thing is this: what you did was extraordinary." What you gave up 2 years of your life and your money and your freedom to go where you chose to protect a woman who had no idea any of it was happening is not something I can be angry about even when I try, and I have tried. You don't have to be grateful, he said quickly. I know I do not have to be anything, she said, with a firmness that was entirely characteristic. But I am. I am grateful and I am furious and I am. She stopped. She pressed her lips together. I missed you, she said. For 2 years underneath all the anger I missed you. That is the part I am most embarrassed to say. Don't be embarrassed, he said. His voice had changed, lower, more careful. Please. It embarrasses me because it means I cared considerably more than was advisable given the information I had, she said. A sensible woman would have concluded within 3 months that you were not coming back and redirected her feelings accordingly. Are you telling me you are not a sensible woman? He asked. The smallest possible smile crossed her face, barely there, like a light briefly visible through a curtain. I am an extremely sensible woman, she said, who made a very unsensible exception. He looked at her with an expression that was in danger of becoming something she was not quite ready for. She held up a hand. I am not done, she said. All right, he said. He looked faintly amused despite himself, the way he always had when she organized a conversation with the authority of someone who had spent years running a classroom. I am going to move into the house, she said. I am going to repair the kitchen garden and repaint the front porch and put the school books on a shelf in the front room because I intend to start a proper school again as soon as the county agrees to it. With far gone, there is no longer any reason they should not. She paused. I want you to know that is my plan, independent of anything else. It sounds like an excellent plan, he said. The question of anything else, she continued, is something I intend to approach with considerably more caution than I evidently brought to it the first time. That is reasonable, he said. What I am saying, she said, looking at him directly, is that I would like you to stay in Dusty Creek. Not in the house with me, not yet, and perhaps not ever, we will see, but in the town, where we can see each other regularly, and where I can make a properly informed decision about what I feel and what I want, without the pressure of anything being sudden or assumed. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Louisa, I did not come back here expecting anything. I came back because I owed you the truth and the house, and because, he stopped, he looked at her steadily, because there is nowhere else I want to be, not for any expectation, just because being in the same town as you is better than being anywhere else without you. She absorbed that. She turned it over in her mind carefully, checking it for structural weakness the way she checked student work for errors and finding none. All right, she said. Then stay. He stayed. The spring of 1879 moved over Dusty Creek with a gentleness that felt almost apologetic after the harshness of the previous years, as though the weather itself recognized that the people in this particular corner of West Texas had earned a break. The wild plum thickets along the dry creek beds bloomed earlier than usual, and the grass on the flat ground west of town came in green and abundant, and the air in the mornings had a clarity to it that made everything look newly made. Louisa moved into the house on the Hess parcel at the end of March, with Martha Gale's help and the enthusiastic assistance of 3 of her former students, who materialized one Saturday morning with their fathers and proceeded to replace 2 rotted porch boards, clear the kitchen garden, and rehang the gate that had been sagging since anyone could remember. Louisa fed them all cornbread and molasses and was more moved by their presence than she could properly express, because it reminded her that in spite of everything Edmund Farr had done to isolate her, she had still managed to build something real in this town, real connections, real loyalty, real belonging. Ezekiel had taken a room above the livery, which was not the boarding house and not the house, and which was exactly the appropriate distance for a man who was being careful not to assume anything. He came by the house in the evening sometimes, and they sat on the repaired porch and talked, and it was remarkably like what they had done on Martha Gale's porch in the autumn of 1876, except that now they both knew considerably more, which made the silences more comfortable and the words more precise. He had found work with a land surveying company operating out of Abilene that sent him on regional contracts, which meant he was often in the field for days at a time, but returned to Dusty Creek between jobs with the reliability of a man who has decided where home is. He was good at the work, better than anyone at the company had anticipated when they hired him, and within a month he was being offered the lead position on a major contract to survey the boundary lines of 6 new homestead parcels along the Creek Valley to the north of town. Louisa began her school again in April. She submitted a formal application to the County Board of Education, citing her 3 years of previous experience in the district, and the board, now constituted without the 2 members who had owed Edmund Farr money, both of whom had quietly resigned their positions when Farr's legal troubles became public knowledge, approved her appointment within a week. She opened the school in the building that had been used as a feed storage space during the intervening years, cleared it out with the help of her first wave of students, brought in benches and a proper slate board, and by the first week of April she had 22 students and a waiting list. She was happy. This was, she realized one morning in May while standing in her kitchen garden watching the first bean shoots come through the soil, an unusual state for her, not unfamiliar, not impossible, but unusual enough to deserve acknowledgement. She had her house and her work and her town, slowly reshaping itself around the absence of Edmund Farr's influence, and she had Ezekiel returning from his survey contracts with creek mud on his boots and survey maps in his saddlebag, and a quiet, steady presence that she had spent 2 years undervaluing by its absence. He brought her things from the field occasionally, not gifts exactly, but findings. A particularly good geode from a limestone outcropping near the northern parcels, a handful of prairie wildflowers he had noted she would not otherwise have seen this late in the season, a paper he had made careful drawings on of a prairie hawk nest he had observed for 3 days from a distance. These small offerings were so entirely in character that they made her chest ache a little each time, because they were the way a man who was not good with grand gestures showed you that he saw you not in the manner of acquisition, but in the manner of a person who paid careful attention to the world and had decided you were part of it. By June she had stopped pretending she was not in love with him. This was a decision rather than a discovery, or rather, the discovery had been made some time ago, and the decision was to stop arguing with it. She had been in love with Ezekiel Merritt since the winter of 1876, when he had offered to help her grade arithmetic papers at a supper table, and the 2 years of absence had not changed that, and the 3 months of careful, deliberate, appropriately paced reacquaintance since his return had only confirmed what she already knew with the thoroughness of a scientific proof. She told him this on a June evening on her porch, plainly and directly, the way she told her students mathematical truths, not apologetically, but as fact, as something she had verified and was now prepared to state with confidence. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Louisa, I have been in love with you since you told me I was solving a surveying equation wrong and then showed me the correct method with the patience of a saint and the authority of a professor." She laughed. It came out surprised and genuine, the kind of laugh that doesn't plan itself. "That was the autumn of 1876, she said. "I know when it was," he said. "I have known ever since." She looked at him in the June evening light, warm and long, the kind of light that makes everything in Texas look like it was painted by someone who loved the place. She thought about 3 years of difficulty and 2 years of not knowing and 3 months of cautious, careful rebuilding, and she thought about what it meant that they had arrived here anyway, on this porch she now owned, in this town she had refused to leave, with the truth finally fully known between them. "Come here," she said. He crossed the porch to her and sat beside her on the bench, and she took his hand, and he held it with the same careful economy he brought to everything, like something precious. They sat there as the light changed and the evening settled and the sounds of Dusty Creek moved around them, And it was not the dramatic culmination that novels described, but it was something better. It was the feeling of a door opening onto a room that had always been there, that you had been walking past for years, that was finally, simply, yours. He did not kiss her that evening. He waited another week, because Ezekiel Merritt had learned patience the hard way and applied it with scrupulous care to everything that mattered. The kiss happened on a Saturday afternoon at the edge of the kitchen garden, when she turned from inspecting the bean plants to say something about the northern fence needing repair, and found him looking at her with an expression that stopped the words entirely, and she put her free hand against his jaw, the beard she hadn't known at first but had grown entirely accustomed to, and he kissed her with the same deliberate, unhurried certainty he brought to everything. And it was thorough and entirely unambiguous, and she kissed him back with the full weight of 3 years of compressed feeling, and the fence and the beans were both entirely forgotten for some considerable time. They were not hasty after that. Ezekiel asked her to marry him in August, on the porch in the evening without theatrics, in a way that was so characteristic of him, a simple question, a genuine one with no assumption about the answer, that she was smiling before he finished the sentence. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. Ezekiel, you absolute man, yes." He laughed. She had heard him laugh before, but not like this, not from the fullness of genuine happiness, and it was the best sound in the room by a considerable margin. They were married in September of 1879 in the Dusty Creek Church, which had its steeple now, finally completed that spring with lumber from the northern parcels. Martha Gale stood with Louisa, and the surveying company's foreman, a taciturn Scotsman named Alastair Dunn, stood with Ezekiel, and 23 of Louisa's students attended the ceremony with their parents and presented her afterward with a laboriously printed card signed by every child in the school, which she kept folded in her Bible for the rest of her life. They had their wedding supper at the house on the former Hess parcel, Louisa's house, now their house with Martha Gale, and a small collection of people who had been genuine in their kindness during the difficult years. And Bess Holloway from the Copper Bit brought a cider that was considerably stronger than advertised, and Alastair Dunn turned out to play the fiddle with unexpected skill, and there was dancing on the porch until midnight, and then another hour or two past that. When the guests had gone and the lamps were burning low, they sat on that porch together in the quiet of the late September night, the stars enormous overhead as they always are in West Texas, the country spreading out around them in all directions, open and dark and impossibly large. "I kept thinking," Louisa said, in the worst of those 2 years, that I was not someone who got to have this." She gestured vaguely, meaning the house, the night, the man beside her. "I kept thinking I had miscounted something, that I had made an error somewhere in my calculations, that whatever I had thought was building between us had been a mistake in the arithmetic." "You did not make an error," he said. "No," she said, "but it took a long time to be certain." He turned to look at her. In the starlight his gray eyes were dark and absolutely steady, the eyes of a man who had found where he was going and had no intention of losing it again. "Louisa," he said, "I am going to spend a considerable amount of time making certain you know that." She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. The night air was cool and smelled of grass and dust, and the faint sweetness of the wild plum thickets along the creek. And Dusty Creek made its small sounds in the distance, a dog barking, a horse shifting in its stable, the creak of a sign swinging in the soft wind, and Louisa Bailey Merritt sat on her own porch in her own house, next to the man she had waited for without knowing she was waiting, and she felt, with a clarity she had never felt before about anything so purely personal, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The years that followed had the particular quality of a life that has been thoughtfully chosen rather than accidentally accumulated. Ezekiel's work with the surveying company kept him busy but not absent. The regional contracts brought him home to Dusty Creek between jobs, and he developed a reputation in the field that brought better contracts and eventually a partnership offer from the company, which he accepted in the spring of 1880, with the condition that he maintain his base of operations in Dusty Creek rather than Abilene. Louisa's school grew. By 1880, she had 31 students and an assistant, a young woman named Clara Webb, who had arrived in Dusty Creek the previous autumn with the same kind of truncated $40 trajectory that Louisa had followed 4 years before, except that Louisa was now in a position to receive her properly, to offer her the schoolteacher's position that had been closed to her for so long, and to make sure she was housed at Martha Gale's boarding house, where Martha would look after her with the same unceremonious, capable generosity she had extended to Louisa in the early years. In the spring of 1880, Louisa discovered she was expecting their first child. She told Ezekiel on a Sunday morning in April while he was reading the Abilene paper at the kitchen table, and he put the paper down very carefully and looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not immediately have a word for, and then he stood up and took her face in both his hands and held it like something he intended to keep, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness so complete it made her breath catch. "Are you pleased?" she asked, because she needed to hear it. "Louisa," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that meant he was doing what she sometimes did, keeping everything together by main force. "I am more pleased than I know how to say." "Then say something approximate," she said. He thought for a moment. "I feel as though the world has added a room," he said. "A whole room I did not know was possible and now cannot imagine existing without." She pressed her hand against his chest. "That is a very good approximation," she said. Their son was born in November of 1880, a solid and urgent arrival with a considerable amount of opinion about his entry into the world, and they named him James William Merritt, James for Louisa's father and William for Ezekiel's older brother, who was working a cattle ranch in Colorado, and who sent a letter of congratulations that arrived 6 weeks after the birth, slightly damp from river crossing, that Louisa read aloud at the kitchen table with James William on her lap, looking at the ceiling with the profound philosophical detachment of a very new person. Martha Gale came to see the baby and held him with practiced ease and called him a handsome, serious-looking child, which was accurate. He had Ezekiel's gray eyes and Louisa's dark hair, and an expression of systematic inquiry that suggested he would have opinions about arithmetic by the age of 4, which proved to be entirely correct. Ezekiel was a father the way he was everything with attention and care, and the specific patience of a man who understood that being good at something required practice, and that practice required showing up. He walked with James when the baby was restless at night, talking quietly in that low, unhurried voice about whatever he happened to be thinking about: survey mathematics, the behavior of creek water in drought conditions, the names of stars, and Louisa, lying awake listening from the next room, thought more than once that their son was receiving the most unusual and comprehensive education available to any child in West Texas, delivered largely between midnight and 3 in the morning. In 1882, they expanded the house, a new room added to the east side, built by Ezekiel over the course of 6 months with Alastair Dunn's help, and the enthusiastic, not always useful assistance of several of Louisa's older students who needed practical mathematics problems, and found that building a room provided them in abundance. The new room gave them space for James, who at nearly 2 years old had developed a strong interest in locomotion and required considerably more square footage than he had as an infant. The school had become genuinely established by this point, recognized by the county board as one of the most successful district schools in the region. Louisa's approach, rigorous mathematics, strong reading, geography, and natural history woven through everything, was unusual enough to attract the notice of the Territorial Education Office in Austin, who sent an inspector in the autumn of 1882. The inspector, a careful man named Hobbs, spent a day at the school and wrote a report that described it as among the finest examples of frontier educational practice currently operating in the territory, and recommended it as a model for newly established districts. Louisa was pleased by this in the quiet way she was pleased by things she had worked hard for, not with vanity, but with the specific satisfaction of having been right about something that mattered. She was also, by the time Inspector Hobbs made his visit, expecting their second child, a fact she had not announced publicly because it was still early and she had learned from James's arrival that the first months were not to be assumed. She told Ezekiel in August, again in the kitchen, though this time he was not reading the paper but was instead attempting to draw a site map of the new survey contract and producing results that she pointed out, with genuine affection, were not quite to scale. He took the news with the same quality of feeling as the first time, slightly more practiced but no less genuine, the kind of joy that does not diminish with repetition because it is attached to something real. He looked at her over the survey map with those steady gray eyes and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said. "James is going to take this as a personal challenge," he said. "James takes everything as a personal challenge," she said. "He is your son." "He is your son," Ezekiel said. "The curiosity is entirely inherited." She threw a kitchen towel at him. He caught it with the ease of a man who had learned to be alert in a house containing a toddler, and he laughed, and the map fell off the table, and James, who had been listening from the doorway with his thumb in his mouth and his gray eyes wide, announced in his 2-year-old's commanding voice that he was hungry. Their second child was born in February of 1883, a girl this time, and they named her Elena Ruth. She arrived into the world with considerably more equanimity than her brother had, and regarded the kitchen ceiling on her first morning at home with the calm assessment of someone deciding whether the accommodations were acceptable. Ezekiel held her in the gray winter light coming through the kitchen window and looked at her small face with an expression so unguarded that Louisa, watching from the bed where she had been strictly ordered to remain by the midwife, had to look away for a moment because the sight of it was almost too much. "She has your eyes," he said. "James has yours," Louisa said. "It is equitable." James himself, now 2.5 years old and in command of a vocabulary that startled visitors, stood beside his father's elbow and examined his sister with the serious appraisal of a person conducting a technical evaluation. "Small," he said finally. "She will grow," Ezekiel told him, "as fast as I did." "Faster, I suspect." James considered this. "All right," he said, in a tone that suggested he was granting permission. Then he asked for his dinner because some things remained constant. Life in Dusty Creek had changed considerably since the early years. The town had grown, attracted by the surveying work that was opening up new homestead land to the north and east, and by the cattle trail traffic that continued to move through on its way to the Kansas railheads. New businesses had arrived, a proper bank, a second general store, a doctor's office whose proprietor, a methodical young man named Beaumont, had arrived from St. Louis with a genuine medical degree and a skeptical view of frontier medicine that Louisa found entirely refreshing. A telegraph line had reached Dusty Creek in 1881, connecting it to the wider world in a way that made the isolation of the early years feel, in retrospect, even more complete. Edmund Farr's name came up occasionally, not with the weight it had once carried, but as a historical reference, the way people mention past storms, cataloged and recorded, and no longer capable of immediate damage. Some of his former employees had stayed in the region after his departure and had done well enough without his influence. Some had followed him to Fort Worth. The deputy at the county clerk's office who had flagged land record inquiries for him had quietly resigned and moved his family to Oklahoma Territory. The 2 town council members who had voted against Louisa's teaching contract in 1877 had both been replaced in the subsequent election, and both of their replacements were among the parents whose children attended Louisa's school, which Louisa found privately satisfying in a way she did not particularly advertise. One afternoon in the spring of 1883, when Alina was 3 months old, and James was navigating the world with the unstoppable momentum of a small person who has recently mastered running. Ezekiel came home from a week in the field with an expression she had learned to read over 4 years of marriage. The expression of a man who had been thinking about something carefully and was ready to say it. He sat down at the kitchen table where she was nursing Alina and reading a letter from the Territorial Education Office, and he said, "I have been offered the head of the survey partnership." She looked up. "Alistair Dunn is leaving. He wants to go home to Scotland," Ezekiel said. "His mother is not well." "Ah," she said. She shifted Alina and put the letter down. "And the head position would mean more responsibility, more income, possibly more travel initially while I establish the new contracts, but in the long term less field work and more office work, which means more time here." He paused. "I wanted to discuss it with you before I gave them an answer." This was characteristic of him, not because he needed her permission, and not because she needed to be consulted as a formality, but because he had understood from very early in their marriage that Louisa's opinion on things that affected their shared life was not optional input but essential data, and he treated it accordingly. They discussed it through supper and past it, with James running commentary from the edge of the conversation whenever he could insert himself, which was frequently, because he had inherited both his parents' interest in the way things worked and felt strongly that most discussions should include him. By the time Alina had been fed and put to sleep in the new room and James had been persuaded, by a combination of Ezekiel's patience and Louisa's firm authority, that bedtime applied to him as well as to everyone else, they had reached a decision. Ezekiel would take the partnership. He would manage the initial increased travel for 6 months, after which the contracted work would stabilize. Louisa would continue the school through the following year, and then discuss with the county board the possibility of hiring a second full-time teacher, which would give her slightly more flexibility as the children grew older. It was not a dramatic decision. It was the kind of decision that two people make when they have built something real together and are thinking about how to keep building it practical, considered, made with full information and genuine regard for both parties' needs and capabilities. It was the kind of decision that nobody writes poems about, but that holds a life together with the quiet strength of good timber in a sound structure. Ezekiel took the partnership. The initial 6 months were demanding. He was often away for stretches of 4 or 5 days, covering ground from the northern parcels to the Pecos River Valley, and Louisa managed the house and the children and the school with the organizational authority of someone who had been managing complex operations since she was 19 years old. She was not alone. Martha Gale was a constant presence, now less a landlady and more a member of the extended family that the Merritts had assembled over the years, and Clara Webb at the school was thoroughly capable, and the neighbors on the eastern edge of town, a young couple named Hargrove who had homesteaded the parcel adjacent to the Merritt house, were generous with time and help. But she missed him. This was a fact she did not belabor. She was not a woman who wasted energy on things she could not change. But it was present, real, the specific weight of a house that contains the particular absence of a particular person. When he came home from those longer stretches, there was always a moment on the porch when she would look up from whatever she was doing and see him coming down the road with the dust of the field still on him, and something in her simply opened, the way a hand opens to release something it has been holding very tightly, and she understood every time that this specific, irreplaceable person coming back to her at the end of a stretch of road was the thing she had been building toward without knowing it. Through all the years before, and all the difficult years in between. He brought James a piece of petrified wood from the Pecos Valley that the boy kept on his windowsill and examined with scientific seriousness for months. He brought Alina, when she was old enough to be interested, small smooth stones from the creek beds he surveyed, different colors, which she arranged and rearranged with the focused creativity of a child who finds the world endlessly remixable. He brought Louisa, from a trip to Abilene in the autumn of 1883, a set of 3 mathematics texts that had been published by a university press in Chicago, more advanced than anything currently available in West Texas, that she held in both hands in the doorway and looked at with an expression he later described to Alastair Dunn, in a letter to Scotland, as the face of someone who has been given exactly the right thing. The winter of 1883 brought a cold that settled over the plains with unusual severity, freezing the creek beds and keeping the cattle close to the ranches, and making the road between Dusty Creek and Abilene nearly impassable for 2 weeks in January. Ezekiel was home for most of it, the survey contracts suspended until the ground thawed, and the family occupied the house with the warm, compressed vitality of people who have learned to find everything they need within a small space. James, 3 years old now and in full command of his personality, which was considerable, had declared his intention to learn surveying by Christmas, and had been given a simplified explanation of triangulation by his father using string and sticks in the kitchen garden, which he had then applied, with typical Merritt thoroughness, to measure the distances between every item of furniture in the house and report his findings to anyone who would listen. Eleanor, 10 months old, had begun to walk the previous month with the triumphant confidence of someone who has solved a difficult problem through persistent experimentation, and crossed the kitchen floor repeatedly as though conducting a victory lap. On a January evening, with the cold pressing against the windows and the stove making its warm ticking sounds, Ezekiel sat in the kitchen chair with Eleanor on his knee and James leaning against his arm, explaining something about the triangulation of the dining table. And Louisa looked at the 3 of them from the doorway and felt something so complete it had no room for anything else inside it. Not the nervous, provisional happiness of the early years, not the complicated, carefully constructed contentment of someone who has learned not to want too much, but something solid and entire, a happiness that had been built rather than found, and that held its shape. Ezekiel looked up from James's earnest explanation of dining table triangulation and met her eyes across the kitchen, and he smiled, not the small controlled expression he often wore in public, but the full one, the one she had earned over all these years, the one that changed his whole face. She smiled back. James, noting that adult attention had drifted from the crucial topic of furniture measurement, immediately increased his volume and specificity, and Eleanor, taking his raised voice as encouragement, added her own vocalization to the discussion, and the kitchen was briefly and beautifully cacophonous. By the spring of 1884, Dusty Creek had settled into the shape it would hold for the following decade, not finished, not static, but established, a town that had found its proportions and was growing into them with the particular confidence of a place that has survived its worst years and knows it. The church had a proper organ now. The bank had a second teller. The school had a second teacher, and enrollment for the autumn term was projected at 45 students. Louisa's reputation as an educator had spread through the region in ways that occasionally surprised her. She received letters from other school districts asking for her curriculum materials and her approach to teaching natural history in a frontier context, and she answered them all with the same patient thoroughness she brought to everything, because she believed in the work and believed it deserved to be shared. In April of 1884, she received a letter from the Territorial Education Office in Austin offering her a position on the newly established Territorial Teachers Commission, a body being created to develop standardized curricula for frontier schools across Texas. It was an honor and a recognition and a complicated logistical problem, since the commission met 4 times a year in Austin, and Austin was not nearby. She showed the letter to Ezekiel at the kitchen table, which remained the headquarters of all significant household decisions, and he read it carefully and then said, "You should do it." It means 4 trips to Austin every year, she said. Each one is at least a week. Clara Webb is fully capable of managing the school, he said, and James and Alina and I will not dissolve in your absence. I know you won't dissolve, she said. I am considering the chaos. He looked at her with serene confidence. I survived 2 years in Fort Worth and Austin as a federal investigation witness, he said. I can manage 2 children and a kitchen for a week at a time. James has specific opinions about bread, she said. Detailed, extensive opinions. Then he and I will have an interesting discussion about bread, Ezekiel said. Louisa, say yes. You have been building toward something like this for 8 years. Say yes. She said yes. The first commission meeting in Austin was in October of 1884, and she was gone for 8 days. And when she came home to Dusty Creek on a Thursday afternoon to find her house intact, her children healthy and apparently well fed, and her husband at the kitchen table explaining to James the principles of trigonometric surveying, using the very mathematics texts he had brought her from Abilene the previous autumn, she stood in the doorway with her traveling bag still in her hand and felt. For a moment, genuinely overwhelmed, Ezekiel looked up, James looked up. Alina, who was 18 months old and had developed a strong philosophy about greeting returning family members, launched herself across the kitchen floor with the full force of her personality and attached herself to Louis's leg. How was Austin? Ezekiel asked. Extraordinary, she said. She set down her bag and picked Alina up and held her with one arm and looked at her husband and her son over her daughter's dark head. There are 12 educators on the commission from across the territory, and every one of them is doing remarkable work in impossible conditions, and the commission is going to mean something real for these school districts. The children in this territory are going to have better options because of what that body is building. She paused. Also, I missed you all intolerably. James made up a theorem about bread, Ezekiel said. I heard it was coming, she said. It has significant structural flaws, Ezekiel said, but the ambition is admirable. James, who had been following this exchange with the patience of someone waiting for his turn, announced that his theorem about bread was not a theorem but an observation, and that there was an important difference. And Louisa laughed and set Alina down and crossed the kitchen and kissed her husband in the way she always kissed him when she had been away, with the full acknowledgement of what his absence felt like and what his presence meant, which was always more than she had words for, so she put it in the kiss instead. Welcome home, he said against her hair. It is a very good home, she said, and it was. It had been from the beginning, even before she knew it. Even when it was just a deed on a table in the back room of a saloon, and a man with pale gray eyes and trail dust on his coat saying words that had cracked open something she had nailed shut, even before she understood fully what he had done and why, even in the complicated, beautiful mess of arriving at love, honestly after everything that had stood in the way. It had been home, because he was in it, and she was in it, and the work they were both doing was real and mattered to real people. And the ground under them was solid and their own. They lived in that house for 30 more years. They were not easy years. No years in West Texas in that era were easy, and the territory had its droughts and its economic collapses and its political convulsions and its regular reminders that the frontier did not become safe or simple simply because you had built something worth protecting on it. They had their own difficult seasons, as every long marriage does, disagreements that took days to work through, worries about children and money and health that kept them awake at night, the ordinary grinding work of building a life in a place that demanded everything you had. But the house held. The marriage held. The school became one of the most respected institutions in the county, and Louisa served on the Territorial Teachers Commission for 11 years, until Texas was no longer a territory in the governing sense, and the commission was absorbed into the state education system, and her work there influenced the education of thousands of children she would never meet and whose names she would never know. James grew up to be a surveyor, which surprised no one who had observed his childhood closely. He went to college in Austin, the University of Texas, which opened in 1883 and which Louisa had written to about scholarships with her usual organized persistence, and came back to Dusty Creek with a degree and a quiet young woman from Houston named Adelaide, who proved to be exactly the right person for James in all the ways that matter, which Louisa recognized within the first hour of their acquaintance. Eleanor grew up to be a doctor, which surprised almost everyone except Ezekiel, who had noticed her systematic approach to the small stones she collected as a toddler and recognized in it the methodology of someone who would eventually need a more complex system to organize. She went to a women's medical college in Philadelphia in 1900 and returned to Texas 3 years later with a medical degree and a determination to practice in a frontier town where doctors were still genuinely needed. And she set up her practice in Dusty Creek, next to the office where old Dr. Beaumont had finally, at the age of 73, retired. They had a third child in 1886, another boy, named Thomas Alastair for the Scotsman who had stood at their wedding, and who, from his mother's house in Edinburgh, sent a letter so full of genuine delight that Louisa cried over it at the kitchen table, which she did not particularly apologize for. Thomas grew up to be the quietest of the three, with his father's stillness and his mother's precision, and he went west, further west, into New Mexico territory, and built a cattle operation that eventually stretched across country Ezekiel had surveyed years before. Martha Gale lived to be 81 years old, in her boarding house on the main street of Dusty Creek, surrounded by the town she had held steady through all its difficult years. And when she died in the spring of 1901, the whole of Dusty Creek attended the funeral, and Louisa stood at the grave with her hand in Ezekiel's, and thought about a woman reaching across a breakfast table without saying a word, and the 30-second kindness that had made 30 years of living possible. On an evening in the late spring of 1909, Louisa and Ezekiel sat on the porch of the house on the former Hess parcel, which was their house now in every way that time and love and daily life can make a place yours. The porch had been repaired so many times it bore almost no original timber, and the kitchen garden had been completely replanted after a drought year in 1893, and was now producing more than they needed most seasons, which they gave away. The house had rooms that had been added and rooms that had been repurposed as the children grew and left and visited and brought their own children, who ran through the kitchen with the same unstoppable momentum as James had at 2.5 years old. Ezekiel was 59 years old. His dark hair had gone thoroughly silver, which suited him in a way she had not anticipated but appreciated thoroughly. His hands were still the same careful hands, a little more marked by decades of field work, still precise in their movements. He had retired from active field surveying the previous year at the company's insistence, not because he had lost the ability, but because at 58 he was the most experienced surveyor in the region, and the company had decided his knowledge was more valuable in the office than in the field, which was probably true. Louisa was 55. Her hair was mostly dark still, with white at the temples, and she wore it the same way she always had, pinned up practically and frequently coming undone in a way that had never particularly concerned her. She had left the school's daily operation to Clara Webb and Clara's successor 5 years ago, though she still taught the advanced mathematics class on Tuesday and Thursday mornings because she loved it, and because she was better at it than anyone else available. She remained on the state education board in an advisory capacity, writing reports and letters with the same organized thoroughness that had characterized everything she had done since she was a 22-year-old woman with $43 and a trunk full of books. The evening light was long and warm, the way it always was at this time of year in West Texas, the sky going through its sequence of colors with the unhurried magnificence of something that has been doing this every day for an eternity and sees no reason to rush. The town made its sounds in the distance. A dog barked. Somewhere a child was called in for supper, the voice carrying on the still air with perfect clarity. Ezekiel reached over and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held his the way she had held it for 30 years. "I have been thinking," he said. "You are always thinking," she said. "It is one of your most consistent qualities." "I have been thinking," he said again, with the patient insistence of a man who knew how to wait out a wit, "about how it could all have gone differently, at any number of points. The investigation could have taken longer. Farr could have learned what I was doing in time to stop it. The deed could have been contested at the county level and tied up in legal arguments for years." "But it wasn't," she said. "But it wasn't," he agreed. "I think about that. I think about the fact that there were a great many ways it could have failed, and somehow it did not fail, and we are here." She looked at the evening sky. She thought about the back room of the Copperbit Saloon and the sound of a deed hitting a table and her own hands trembling above it, and how she had not known then what she would later know, that the trembling was not fear or anger or confusion, though it was all of those things too, but was also something underneath them, a resonance, the sensation of a life about to become finally, fully, entirely what it was meant to be. "Ezekiel," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am glad it did not fail," she said. "I am very profoundly glad." He raised her hand and pressed it to his mouth, the way he had done 1,000 times, a gesture so quiet and so completely his that she would have known it in the dark, in any room, under any circumstances. "So am I," he said, "every single day. So am I." The evening settled around them. The light changed. The stars began to appear, one by one and then in their thousands, the enormous West Texas sky going full dark and luminous and impossibly deep. And Louisa and Ezekiel Merritt sat on their porch in their town with their long life behind them, and however many years remained ahead. And the house that had started with a deed on a table, and a man saying, "I bought you a home," held them gently in its walls like something it had always intended to do, like something it had been built for. In the years that remained to them, and there were more than they might have expected, because they were both constitutionally stubborn people who had married each other partly in recognition of that quality. They watched Dusty Creek continue to grow and change with the new century, watched their children's lives expand in directions they had not predicted and could not have planned, held their grandchildren, and told them stories about how things had been in the early days, when the territory was still rough and unfinished and full of both danger and possibility. They never left Dusty Creek, not for any extended time. They traveled occasionally, once to Philadelphia to see Alina receive a citation from a medical society, once to Austin for a ceremony recognizing Louisa's contribution to territorial education. Once, the trip Louisa treasured most, to New Mexico Territory to see the land Thomas had built his operation on, standing in the wide country where the light was different from Texas light, and the air was higher and the horizon went even further. Thomas standing beside them, explaining the boundary lines with the language of a man who had grown up hearing his father talk about what land meant and how it was measured. But they came back. They always came back because Dusty Creek was the place where their life was, and their life was the thing they had built together out of silence and secrets and sacrifice, and a deed on a table and 30-some years of daily, deliberate love. It was enough. It was, by any honest measure, more than enough. It was everything.